Okay, welcome and thank you everybody for being here this evening. This is the first of what will be an ongoing series of talks sponsored by the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York as part of its new Freedom 2027 initiative. And for this first talk, we are very lucky to have here with Dr. David Gellman, Professor of History at DePauw University. Freedom 2027 is a 3-year period of commemoration and programs culminating. Whoops. You can hear me okay? Okay. Commemorating the bicentennial of the end of slavery, the abolition of slavery in New York State. And this initiative is meant to bring attention to both the essential role of enslavement in New York's economic development and the role that freedom seekers, the Underground Railroad, and abolitionists played in bringing an end to 200 years of oppression. The various projects as part of Freedom 2027 can all be found on the URCNYS website, and we encourage you to look at the site and to submit your information and questions to us. So now let's turn to tonight's speaker. Dr. Gellman's title is Unraveling Slavery in New York from 1777 to 1827. This talk will examine the impetuses and obstacles that produced a gradual abolition law in 1799, and a generation later, the declared end of slavery in New York State on July 4th, 1827. The story of Northern emancipation and its complicated legacy emphasizes the interplay between ideology and activism, enslaved and enslavers, political structure, and individual initiative. Dr. Gellman is professor of history at DePauw University in Greencastle, Indiana, where he has taught since 1999. His 2022 book, Liberty's Chain: Slavery, Abolition, and the Jay Family of New York, was honored with the Herbert H. Lehman Prize. Other books include Emancipating New York, The Politics of Slavery and Freedom, and Jim Crow New York, a documented history of race and citizenship. He has also published essays on the Missouri Compromise, on James Fenimore Cooper, and we hope we'll hear more about this later, on Bruce Springsteen. We'll handle questions. If you can't remember what you want to say, please put them in the chat, and we can determine at the end about taking live questions as well. So everyone, please welcome Dr. David Gellman.
Thank you for that warm introduction and for inviting me to give this keynote address for your laudable initiative to commemorate 1827, the Emancipation Bicentennial. It's very exciting that you picked up the baton on this one. So let's start at the end and work backward. 1827. Liberty, kind goddess, brightest of the heavenly deities that guide the affairs of men. So began William Hamilton's oration delivered on July 4th, 1827 at the African Zion Church to mark the occasion of the official end of slavery in New York State. This leading member of the free Black community in New York City contemplated the present, the past, and the future on the day that thousands of enslaved people born before July 4th, 1799, formally could claim their freedom. The goddess Liberty he apostrophized, by a voice as sweet as the music of heaven, yet strong and powerful, reaching to the extreme boundaries of the state of New York, hath declared that we, the people of color, the sons of Afric, are free. The state had peacefully applied the principles of the Declaration of Independence to challenge, quote, prejudice, injustice, and foul oppression. To white allies, starting with the Quakers, but soon expanding ecumenically in the New York Manumission Society, Hamilton attributed a key role in the abolitionist victory. Hamilton's celebratory mood contended with his desire to dismantle the still pervasive false philosophy that ranked Black people as inferior, even soulless, and threats to alleged white purity. But he had checked himself in the midst of his critique of racism. I am sorry to break from this unraveling too soon, for I do mean to unravel this mystery of superiority. Thus, Hamilton pivoted from white prejudice to address Black youth, who he charged with the responsibility of embracing the path of virtue, the study of science, and the highest standing in literature. Hamilton implied, rather optimistically on this momentous day, that Black hands could mold their own future. 1796. 31 years earlier, William Hamilton, then a carpenter in his early 20s, sought to mold that future, boldly laying out the case for action against slavery in a remarkable letter to John Jay. The highly accomplished founding father had recently traded in his judicial robes as the inaugural Chief Justice of the United States to become governor of New York. Is not everyone that keeps slaves that are Negroes continually stealing? Hamilton queried the governor, who himself owned slaves. In this letter, Hamilton aimed at the heart and at the head. He shed, quote, a silent tear at the miserable misfortunes of the enslaved, and quoted to Jay the British anti-slavery poet William Cowper. Is there, as ye sometimes tell us, is there one who reigns on high? Does he bid them buy and sell us, speaking from the throne in the sky? Hamilton contrasted America's rhetorical embrace of liberty and equality with its practice of bondage. He called for action, quote, is it not high time that the scandal of this country be taken away? Is it not time that Negroes should be free? God would bless Jay and his family, wrote Hamilton, for advancing Black freedom. Although the young William Hamilton traversed age, class, and race to make his case, his hope that Governor Jay would do something was not misplaced. John Jay in 1785 became the first inaugural president of the New York Manumission Society, the same organization upon which Hamilton in 1827 lavished so much praise. As we will discuss in a few moments, the late 1790s indeed proved a propitious time to forge legal inroads against New York's long-standing, deeply entrenched slaveholding regime. 1783. As the British evacuated Manhattan, the Empire's last stronghold in the newly independent nation, with which they had concluded a peace treaty after a brutal war, it was by no means clear to African Americans in New York that their experience in the future would be other than an enslaved one. Rachel Willis, her husband Samuel, and their 3 young children certainly were unwilling to take their chances. They decided to embark to Canada as free people. Thus, Willis and her family boarded the Nesbit, and you can see here where the arrow points an advertisement for the Nesbit on November 17th, rather than risk a return to slavery on Long Island, where she was from. As a New York City newspaper from that day made plain, and this is also in the same newspaper on the same day, slavery, with its cycle of resistance and recapture, remained a feature of life there, as you can see from this $5 reward for a runaway woman named Dinah. The old regime was very much alive as the Patriots retook Manhattan from the evacuating Tories and British. And then the ad right below it hints that there's another possibility, as it mentions the opportunity for wage labor. So it's a very, this moment in November 1783 really illustrates in one newspaper the possible fates of Black people in the wake of the Revolution. Flee to freedom in Canada, continued slavery where runaways would be chased, advertised, turned into products with a reward and thrown back into slavery. And then this hint that some Black people might actually access the wage labor market. So Rachel, like thousands of other people gathered in Manhattan during this concluding moment of the Revolutionary War, decided not to take her chances in America and departed with the vanquished British. 1777. As resistance to empire morphed into the concrete process of turning colonies into states, the idea occurred to some white patriot leaders that a real link connected their struggle for liberty from British oppression and the freedom of Black people held in actual bondage. And if you read from the beginnings of the imperial crisis in 1763 onward, patriots are constantly referring to the British enslaving them, turning them into slaves, removing their liberty, all the while being surrounded by and often owning enslaved people. But some people made the connection. As the new state composed a new constitution in Kingston in 1777, Gouverneur Morris, who 10 years later would famously write the preamble to the U.S. Constitution, proposed that his state charter include a call for, quote, future legislatures to in future ages, abolish slavery so every human being who breathes the air of the state shall enjoy the privileges of a free man. So he wasn't saying we're going to do it right now, but he wanted in the Constitution of New York at this moment of independence language saying our goal is freedom, and that freedom is to apply to Black people ultimately as well as white people. After initially approving the language, the convention withdrew its support, and indeed, invalidating the state's colonial laws, validated the continuation of slavery. So 1777 was not the turning point that Gouverneur Morris had in mind. It is worth noting, though, up here in that shaded area, that's the future state of Vermont. These are sort of renegade counties of northeastern New York. The Vermont Constitution actually did abolish slavery. And it basically said nobody who's an adult can be a slave in Vermont. So continentally, as well as in New York, the Revolutionary War was a swirl of contradictions, declared self-evident truths of human equality competing with bitter resentment that the British offered freedom to those enslaved by patriot masters who entered Tory lines. And you can see that right there in the Declaration of Independence, in the preamble, all men are created equal, in the grievances, a reference to King George unleashing enslaved people on the patriots. So the contradictions are there from the beginning. Okay, so let's put the brakes on this backward moving narrative before our goal tonight of contemplating why and how we should commemorate 1827 disappears entirely into the myths of time. Let's consider in a more systematic way what William Hamilton in 1827 labeled the semi-century during which, quote, the quiet yet rapid progress of the principles of liberty took place. I hope to show that thanks in part to people like Hamilton himself, the process was definitely not quiet, and its rapidity is a question of perspective. As for progress, there is no doubt that the abolition of slavery in the Empire State was a momentous victory with far-reaching consequences. But as I hope will be clear, the opposition to that progress at every stage ensured that 1877 would be a partial triumph, the product of a struggle that mandated much more struggle ahead if slavery's legacy was ever to truly unravel. As I've already hinted, the institution of slavery was woven into 18th century New York society, with elite and ordinary whites alike taking advantage of the opportunity to direct and exploit slave labor. While the Revolutionary War unsettled the institution in some ways, the ownership of people was remarkably common and widespread on Long Island, Staten Island, Manhattan, and the counties arrayed along the Hudson Valley all the way to Albany. A 1786 census records 18,000 enslaved people in the state. The 1790 census records 21,000 people enslaved. In the counties encompassing present-day Queens, Brooklyn, and Staten Island, between a fifth and a third of households included enslaved people. Ulster County was another stronghold. So in all regions of the original parts of New York, slavery is still a going institution at the conclusion of the war. Political and legal winds, however, signaled the potential for the erosion of the soil in which enslavement had so long rooted itself. As I hinted in my 1777 and 1783 vignettes, Black and white people were connecting the dots between slavery and the war for independence. The rhetoric of patriot resistance from the beginning of the imperial crisis was shot through with analogies between British policy and enslavement. Quakers in Pennsylvania began a long process of divesting themselves of slaveholding starting in the 1750s, and that movement spread to New York Friends as well, who by 1776, the New York Quakers had basically said, if you haven't manumitted your slaves in adulthood, we're going to censure you and kick you out of the meeting. Also in 1780, Pennsylvania passed the nation's first gradual emancipation law. Connecticut and Rhode Island followed suit in 1784. Now, here we should pause and define key terms. When I say manumission, that refers to private acts of liberation, whether negotiated between master and enslaved person, as individual enslavers renounce their rights of ownership. That's what I mean by manumission. Gradual emancipation, for the purpose of today's talk, is a statutory formula that takes a predictable course in the various states where it takes place. And the idea is the state legislature sets a date, says after this date, all people born to enslaved mothers are free and then are obligated to serve their mother's master into some fixed age of adulthood that depends state by state. 18, 21, we'll see what New York does later in the talk. But that's the gradual emancipation formula that Pennsylvania establishes as a kind of a norm in 1780 and is oft imitated in the North. It's also, okay, so that's the definitions. African Americans developed new expectations in this new era, of course. As already hinted, wartime opened up avenues for escape and reclassification. British offers of freedom for those slaves enslaved by patriots if they fled to, and this started in Virginia in 1775, even before independence. The promise of freedom, if you for an enslaved person who abandoned their masters as property and went to British lines and took up arms with the British or came with their family, that was generalized to the entire continent by one of the British generals, General Clinton, and a lot of enslaved people in the New York area and elsewhere took advantage of this. Ultimately, New York, like other states, passed a sort of countermeasure where they said masters could volunteer enslaved men for service, and if they completed that service, they would be free at the end of the service, which is a much less attractive deal because it's entirely in the hands of the master, and it makes freedom contingent, whereas the Britishers said if you flee to British lines, you are free. The pioneering enslaved New York poet Jupiter Hammond articulated in verse a new moral and religious calculus in this era. A poetic dialogue written in 1782 featured a servant issuing instructions to his master and concluded with this couplet: "You cannot to your God attend and serve the God of Mammon." So basically he's saying, he's taking the moral high ground for the servant in this dialogue and saying, which is it, your obligation to God or your obligation to your material wants? A sort of clear reference to slavery. His 1786 poem on slavery pushed farther, contemplating the end of slavery, Black religious faithfulness producing freedom not only in eternity, but in this world as well. Hammond was not merely speculating. The previous year, 1785, saw crucial developments in the fight against slavery, but also revealed the limitations of the state's commitment to change. The New York State Legislature came remarkably close to passing a gradual emancipation law of its own in 1785. Also in 1785, an organization dedicated to advocating against slavery in New York was founded in Manhattan. The New Manumission Society, as William Hamilton recalled many years later, combined Quaker membership and sensibilities with non-Quakers, including some of the leading political men in New York, such as J. Alexander Hamilton and New York Mayor James Duane, and many other prominent New Yorkers. Gradualism and private manumission, not anything more radical, was the order of the day. Aaron Burr's proposal in the legislature in 1785 to grant freedom to all slaves was voted down decisively and received almost no backing from those who were actually in favor of gradual emancipation, mostly attracted votes from those who actually opposed gradual emancipation as sort of thumbing their noses at the gradualists, and essentially went nowhere. But a bill ending servitude at age 22 for the future female children of enslaved mothers and 25 for males actually passed the legislature. Ultimately, however, provisions explicitly designed to curtail the rights of free blacks proved to be the bill's undoing. For the bill contained language barring all people with full or partial African descent from possessing the right to vote. New York's Council of Revisions, which is a body that disappeared with the Constitution of 1821, which consisted of the governor, in this case George Clinton, and two judges, they vetoed the bill. They didn't veto the bill because they were against gradual emancipation. They vetoed it because they could not approve of a law that created this sort of two-track citizenship that denied future black male New Yorkers the opportunity to vote. Their veto message, which is quite remarkable, stated that such a distinction between black and white voters, or whites as voters and blacks by definition as non-voters, violated revolutionary principles of taxation without representation. Moreover, peering into the future, the council argued that barring black men from voting would create an aristocracy of color. Even if only a tiny number of blacks married whites, Over time, millions of people would be deprived of the vote because of a trace of black blood. The twisted racial logic of Jim Crow segregation and South African apartheid, we might say, was anticipated and rejected in this veto message. So again, they weren't opposed to gradual emancipation. They were opposed to gradual emancipation that was going to permanently bar African Americans from equal citizenship. The response, at least in some quarters, to abolition's failure was relief tinged with spiteful arrogance. One of the newspaper submission commented, and I'm deliberately leaving out some of the nastier things that were said, but I'll quote this: "The shame we should inevitably incur from a mixing of complexions in government was avoided." This same piece also conjured up the notion of Quakers and African Americans as disloyal to their new country and not and therefore easily dismissed. The founding of the New York Manumission Society in the midst of the legislative session created an institutional focus for anti-slavery efforts in the state for decades to come. The Manumission Society was avowedly committed to gradualism. Legislatively, that meant advocating for a Pennsylvania-style law, but they were also committed to what I think of as containment. Regulating and combating human trafficking from New York's borders was a critical intermediate step to slavery's foes. The 1785 legislature banned the importation for the purposes of sale of any more slaves. The Manumission Society lobbied hard for an equally important ban, a ban on the exportation of slaves from New York. In other words, they were essentially trying to seal New York's border. Nobody sold in, nobody sold out. In 1788, this goal was achieved. And I think this is important philosophically. More than a decade before New York formally initiated emancipation, the state had denied slave owners a critical property right, a chattel right. And that's very significant. In the grand scheme of things, obviously, it's morally unsatisfying and far short of the mark. But for the legislature to basically limit the rights of slaveholders in a way that they had never been limited before, their ability to control and move their human property was a major milestone, but it was far short of the ultimate goal. A crucial aspect of the Manumission Society's vision from the start was the notion that in the long run, emancipation would produce black citizens. One of its organizing principles was, quote, "to enable African Americans to share equally with us civil and religious liberty." So we can get in later in the Q&A into notions about colonization and expatriation. But the New York Manumission Society, as founded, believed in the notion that ultimately where this was going to lead was equal civil and religious liberty. In pursuance of that goal, one of the most significant achievements in the Manumission Society was the establishment of the African Free School. While it was hardly a perfect vehicle and sometimes expressed the society's broader paternalistic ethos, the school helped to spawn a generation of educated black leaders who played not only a crucial role in the formation of free black institutions, but also formed a network of advocates for emancipation and beyond that equality. So establishing this school, which was definitely also a means of social control and supervision, but it seeded New York Free Black Society with its future leaders in a way that would pay off for generations beyond the scope of my talk. For decades to come, the Manumission Society played a critical role in enforcing laws against importation and exportation. So another reason that these bans mattered is one of the things the New York Manumission Society did was now they could patrol the boundaries. And when they found violations, technical or otherwise, in the law of slavery in New York, they could pounce and work to free individual people. And I really want to stress that this work was by definition collaborative. The only way the Standing Committee, which is sort of the legal arm of the Manumission Society, the only way that they could know that the law was violated is if African Americans in the community brought these cases to them. So the push for abolition laws, the existence of an organization gives black people enslaved and free allies, gives them a wedge, and they can report violations of the law and often expect the Manumission Society to intervene on their behalf. So let me give some examples of that. So under long before the 1777, if your mother was Native American, you were legally not a slave. And this created a wedge of freedom for some people. In February 1798, Richard Hallett, a free black man, reported that his wife, Catherine, had a Native American grandmother. but a Richard Furman of Long Island held Catherine and her 4 children in slavery. Based on corroborating testimony about Catherine's grandmother, Manumission Society representatives negotiated freedom dates for Catherine and 3 of her children. The 4th child, Furman, sold to Richard Hallett for $1. Peter J. Monroe, who was the nephew of John Jay, won the freedom of a woman in Westchester County named Lucy Garrett, whose mother was purported to be Native American. Molly Sears of Newburgh won her freedom because of evidence that her mother was white. Incidences of illegal import and export and outright kidnapping also prompted action. Thomas Dowdall contested, with the help of the Manumission Society, his enslavement as a violation of the 1785 law against importation. He had been transported from New Jersey to New York City, sold, and then promised his freedom in 5.5 years. For 7 years after his arrival in New York, however, he was still detained. So again, Black people are the witnesses to these violations. William Burden's wife, Phyllis, had changed masters 3 times since entering New York via New Jersey, a clear violation of the law. And again, it's this collaboration. It's African Americans reporting these crimes and misdemeanors that activate New York lawyers, pro bono lawyers, to do something. Historian Paul Polgar has calculated that between 1791 and 1801, the Manumission Society's Standing Committee handled 221 cases and succeeded 73% of the time. Surely this had some deterrent effect on malfeasance, especially in and around New York City, while underscoring how determined slaveholders were to exploit vulnerability regardless of the law. This leads me to my next big point. Anti-slavery publicity, changing hearts and minds in the largest slave state north of Maryland, was a sustained and crucial feature of the struggle against slavery and for gradual emancipation. Much of my book, Emancipating New York, investigated the surprising number of ways in which the subjects of slavery insinuated itself into New York's robust political debates in the 1780s and 90s. What I observe is that while defenders of racial slavery status quo were not silent, the critics of slavery and colored prejudice voiced their case powerfully and persistently in newspapers throughout the state at a time when newspapers, and I mean actual newspapers, made out of pulped rags. I don't know if I've got any kids in the audience, but that's what they read. You could literally, they were made out of pulp rags. They were the web, the Twitterverse, the TikTok, the Instagram of the day. This is how people communicated. There were newspapers not just in New York City, but all up and down the Hudson Valley. And in these newspapers, that moral problem with slavery was often aired in some very surprising ways. Let me give you some examples. Sugar. One way that a critique of slavery slipped into New York newspapers was through the promotion of one of upstate New York's most delicious resources, maple sugar. For a brief period, sugar distilled from the state's maple trees was promoted as the guilt-free domestic alternative to importing cane sugar produced by West Indian slaves. William Cooper, the founder of Cooperstown and the father of the famed novelist James Fenimore Cooper, likened maple sugar to buried treasure in Latin American mines, but only if New Yorkers practiced tree conservation. He claimed that New York State could meet the nation's demand for this essential sweetener without, quote, the lash of cruelty on our fellow creatures. His projections were wildly wrong, but my point here is that he was making a moral case. He was priming the pump for moral arguments. Obviously, maple sugar was not going to replace West Indian sugar, but the fact that the argument was made as a moral one, I think, is indicative of a changing climate of opinion in New York. Let me give you another example: piracy. So the fledgling United States was easy prey to foreign foes on the high seas, including the North African pirates of the Mediterranean Sea. And there was a lot of consternation about American sailors pressed into slavery on the Algerian coast. A lot of gnashing of the teeth and hand-wringing and horror about this, that white Americans were being held in slavery in Africa. And various people pointed out that if that was bad, so too was American slavery, that the logic by which Algerian slavery was wrong was the same logic by which African slavery in America was wrong. And no less a figure than Benjamin Franklin chimed in on this. In his final publication of his illustrious life, Franklin, a former slaveholder, wrote a satiric essay pretending to unearth a document from Algiers on the trade of European Christians. Franklin's Algerian courtier could not imagine who would do the work if not Christian slaves, and comforting himself that at least these white slaves were learning Islam. And here, the needle, he's reversing that long-lasting defense of black enslavement in the Americas, that it's a blessing because it's Christianizing these people. So he's hoisting that argument by its own petard in 1790, right before his death. Another striking anti-slavery feature that I've learned to find in the newspapers was poetry. When young William Hamilton quoted anti-slavery to Governor Jay, that didn't come out of nowhere. In newspapers of the day, there was often a poet's corner, usually on the fourth page, third or fourth page. And although other parts of the newspaper could be viciously racist jokes with faux dialects, these poet's corner poems are fascinating. Because they really make the case, the moral case against slavery, and also imagine a black voice as an equal and an elevated participant in dialogue. Now, these are often written by white people, but I want you to hear what's going on. So here is the British poet Cowper, and I got this from Poughkeepsie newspaper in 1788. Fleecy locks and black complexion cannot forfeit nature's claim. Skin may differ, but affection dwells in black and white the same. Poems repeatedly invoke familial love torn asunder, such as in the African Slave Soliloquy, which recalled the transatlantic slave trade's emotional trauma. I see my parents, hear my children cry, and in the flaming cottage, see them die. A striking item in a newspaper in upstate Lansingburg, near Albany and Troy, told the story of misery in prose form of an elderly slave who was contemplating suicide by a river, quote, rather than to return to the house of a severe master, a haughty, disdainful mistress, and an insolent abuse of children. In this story, the slave engaged New York legislature's failure to act against slavery, flouting, quote, the laws of God and human reason. So putting these arguments in the mouth of a slave who's so distraught that he's considering suicide. But the piece concludes with the white listener intervening to prevent the elderly slave from drowning himself in the Mohawk River. The slave then defiantly manipulates Genesis 18, in which Abraham pleads with God to spare the evil cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, and remarks, for the sake of one honest white man who can feel the anguish of his species, I will not take my own life. And again, I believe, and I think Uncle Tom's Cabin bore this point out 2-3 generations later, it's easy to deride sentimentality, but sentimentality requires you, asks you, compels you to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, to cross boundaries of difference and to embrace common humanity. And I was surprised when I did my research years ago how often I found poems and stories like this in newspapers. Such sympathetic voicing of black speakers and black experience in print really did counteract the assumptions that emancipation could only produce second-class citizenship. These fictional enunciations imagine an alternative. But I want to point out that not all black voices in the newspaper were imagined. One of the most remarkable print phenomena in the 1790s was the increasing respect accorded to the slave revolution in the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue. While early in the decade, newspapers registered horror at the slave uprising, by the end of the decade, the famed black general Toussaint Louverture appeared as a figure of order, honor, and eloquence. This portrayal dovetailed with the Adams administration's foreign policy that tilted in his favor. So, I mean, there's these amazing, who knows how accurate they are, but there's these amazing transcripts of Toussaint Louverture actually holding back the radicalism of the white French commissioner and saying, who do you think is going to be punished for your crazy revolutionary ideas of killing all the white plantation owners? He's a force of restraint, of reason, of order. And that this was recorded in American newspapers, in New York newspapers in the 1790s, I found quite remarkable. Of course, slavery itself remained a political issue in New York, and not always in a way that demonstrated the strength of the abolitionist position. John Jay's first campaign for governor in 1792 was hampered by his former role as president of the Manumission Society. When Jay became the inaugural Chief Justice of the U.S. Courts, he resigned his position as president of the New York Manumission Society, but he was still remembered as having been in the Manumission Society and criticized for it. although he refused to back away. I mean, it's amazing. He says, look, I have nothing to apologize for. It is worth noting that his razor-thin loss in that 1792 election shows that he did particularly poorly in the counties with the largest proportion, several of the counties with the largest proportion of slaves. In other words, people were worried, you elect John Jay, he's going to take your slaves away. Jay's negotiation in 1794 of the treaty with Britain that has ever since borne his name angered those who were still mad at the departure of so many enslaved people at the end of the Revolution. Approximately 13,000 Black people departed with the British, 3,000 of them from Manhattan in 1783. And ever since, this was considered a violation of the treaty, and Americans, or at least some Americans, expected the next time that an American diplomat sat across the table from a British representative that they would get monetary compensation for those enslaved people. So Jay, and it's hard to imagine this, the sitting Chief Justice, without renouncing his Chief Justice position, goes to Britain to negotiate this treaty to head off what seems to be a collision course towards war. And the British won't budge on this demand. And Jay even concedes in his letters, I don't think we have a moral leg to stand on here anyway. And certainly we're not going to risk peace for this dodgy moral position. Well, this was among the many reasons that the emerging Republicans, the Jeffersonian Republicans, not the Republican Party of today, but the Jeffersonian Republicans, this is among the many reasons why they felt the Jay Treaty was a horrible sellout. And one of John Jay's former close friends and law partners, and now political rivals, Robert R. Livingston, excoriated Jay for capitulating in the New York newspapers. He fulminated that the British owed America $1.25 million. Rising to the defense of Jay and his treaty was Alexander Hamilton, who wrote under a pseudonym in which he made a powerful anti-slavery argument and an anti-compensation argument. And I think this is important for what I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes. Here's what Hamilton said. In the interpretation of treaties, things odious and immoral are not to be presumed. To return to bondage, people who have been induced to quit their masters in the faith of official proclamations promising them liberty is as odious and immoral a thing as can be conceived. So I found that interesting and revealing that Alexander Hamilton felt comfortable and confident in making a moral case against returning slaves or demanding compensation for them. So maybe a public opinion tide was turning. Just give me one sec. Okay, so 1799, this is a big moment. The state legislature did not prove hospitable to gradual emancipation between 1785 and 1795. The Manumission Society did get its long-sought export ban in 1788, but in 1790, efforts to revise gradual emancipation legislation failed. Slaveholders and representatives from slaveholding regions had effectively dug in their heels. And yet, my reading of political commentary in newspapers suggests a weakening of identity with slaveholding and slaveholder interests, which increasingly became identified with the South. If not odious, to use Hamilton's word, slavery increasingly felt other. Southerners, not New Yorkers, were portrayed as vulnerable to possible slave conspiracies. Federalists needled their allegedly egalitarian Republican rivals for their party's leadership amongst the plantocracy. Even the sainted George Washington was critiqued in a New York newspaper for being a slaveholder. So it's becoming more of a political burden to be associated with slavery than to embrace it as the 1790s progress. The time seemed ripe in the mid-1790s for opponents of slavery to turn up the heat. In the renewed debate over plans to implement Pennsylvania-style gradual emancipation, direct monetary compensation became the new bulwark of those who were opposed to gradual emancipation. And so slaveholders and representatives of slaveholding counties or counties where there were large percentages of slaveholders thought, well, we can either block gradual emancipation or find the way to cash in on it by demanding, if we're going to gradually abolish slavery, we want to be directly, materially, monetarily compensated for this. Essentially a sort of political ransom that slaveholders and their allies were demanding. But, and here's where this map is helpful, quite different from the earlier map I showed you of New York, A major shift in the political playing field tilted decisively against demands for compensation and towards gradual emancipation. In 1796, the state legislature reapportioned and expanded the assembly to account for the state's rapid expansion to the frontier. I mean, look how many more counties and where they are in 1800 compared to that map I showed you of the 1775. The new counties to the west and the north supplied delegations to the state legislature from places where there were virtually no slaves. And it's worth noting because legislatures almost always seem to overrepresent wealth. Slaveholders are, long accounted for a disproportionate number, I think, of the legislature. But in these new counties, not only are there no slaves, but there are fewer representatives who are slaveholders. Protecting slavery or the remnants of slave-infused economy was not a priority in places like Oneida and Herkimer counties, to name a few. Moreover, if the state were to compensate Eastern New York slave owners for losing access to the full lives of their slaves' children, that would be a direct transfer of wealth from the pockets of people who didn't own slaves to slave owners in places like Ulster, Queens, and Westchester. When Dutchess County's William Verplanck proposed a compensation clause in 1798, it fell flat. With New York City's large delegation to the Assembly solidly anti-slavery, the odds of a gradual emancipation bill's passage had dramatically improved. All right, so cutting to the chase, or this part of the chase. In the spring of 1799, the New York State Legislature passed and Governor John Day and his colleagues on the Council of Revision approved an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. Nothing in the law denied free blacks the right to vote, to hold office, to serve as jurors or witnesses, or to marry whom they pleased. All things that were obstacles thrown up in 1785. None of that made it into the gradual emancipation law of 1799. The core provision of the law announced that all children born in New York after July 4, 1799, a date loaded with symbolic meaning, of course, quote, shall be deemed and adjudged to be born free. But male children carried the obligation of serving their mothers' masters till age 25, and females till age 20, men till 28, and female and women till 25. Masters had to register the birth of each such child to assure compliance. In an age of much shorter lifespans, especially for servants ill-housed, ill-clothed, or ill-fed, a significant portion of these free children's lives would be spent in bondage, the benefits of their labor accruing to their masters. But there was little serious consideration among white men who governed, or even white reformers in the Manumission Society, to immediate emancipation. Slavery was far too entrenched in New York to make a cleaner, more just break with the past. Yet no one, not white supporters and certainly not African Americans, viewed the 1799 law as an end unto itself. Slavery's opponents knew that much work remained to be done. The end goal was clear. An abolitionist report on the law from New York looked ahead to, quote, are living in a community in which, within a time not far distant, domestic slavery will be unknown and the blessings of civil and religious liberty will be equally extended to all. So that's the vision in the wake of the 1799 law, at least the vision of black people and their white allies. The laudable goal of slavery, accelerated and accompanied by equal citizenship, became a goal of the increasingly free black population and many of their longtime white allies. But the forces arrayed against these goals were formidable. The paradoxes of 1827 became deeply etched in the state's social, legal, and political landscape. Let's start with some of the stark and often depressing facts about gradualism itself. For ordinary people, change often came slowly. In the southern 6 counties of New York between 1800 and 1820, the percentage of free blacks who lived in free black households barely increased, something from, I think from like 57% to 59%. As the historian Richard Newman documents in an article published just a couple of months ago, not only did slavery remain legal between 1799 and 1827, but individuals often faced a stacked system to achieve actual freedom, with local judges resistant to black claims and white Southern immigrants in places like Rochester brought enslaved people with them into New York. So white people are not inclined always to comply with the law and are willing to take their chances and often successfully beat back legal actions to free that when black people claim their freedom under the new law. The Manumission Society's lawyers remained busy, but they could not be everywhere, nor always produce the necessary evidence to enforce freedom claims. Kidnapping and illegal sales out of state were endemic problems. Statistical extrapolation and harrowing anecdotes support the conclusion that kidnapping was all too common during this period, kidnapping for transport southward. The accelerating expansion of slavery in newer parts of the South enhanced perverse moral incentives. But yet, more than one thing can be true. The more free people there were in New York, the easier it became to gain freedom. Running away to a place like New York City and disappearing into the free African American community became easier as that community grew. And masters were more amenable to negotiating manumissions in exchange for a fixed amount of additional service. In other words, purchasing loyalty by saying, work for another 4 years and I'll give you your freedom. Federal census for New York City records a decrease by 1,000 of the slave population and an increase of 4,000 in the free black population between 1800 and 1810. This shifting ratio of free to enslaved was dramatic in other counties as well. The free black community in Manhattan sustained churches, mutual aid societies, and formed businesses. A black theatrical company operated in New York City between 1821 and 1823. The harassment by white thugs increasingly made it difficult for that theater to keep its doors open. But my point is, this is a tremendous period of institution building for African Americans, of churches, mutual aid societies, burial societies, so that the sort of networks of black people that had always existed under slavery in New York could emerge from the shadows into the public light, and definitely happened. African Americans exercised some of the symbolic rights of citizenship. The U.S. withdrawal from the international slave trade in 1808 and its first anniversary prompted speeches that look back on past successes in the struggle for freedom and look forward to a brighter future. Joseph Sidney's address to the Wilberforce Philanthropic Association, a black self-help organization named for the famous British parliamentary foe of the slave trade, unabashedly plunged into the thicket of partisan politics in the state and the nation. He urged his listeners to become voters, and as voters to cast their ballots for the Federalist Party. Republicans, led by Southern slaveholders, by Jeffersonians and their disastrous policy of embargoing foreign trade, were not to be trusted, he told his listeners. This is how citizens in a politically competitive republic talked, and African Americans are talking that way. Which brings us to a crucial crossroad in our conversation this evening. What would the state lawmakers do with the fact that black freedom was simultaneously rising and still under threat? Would the politically powerful treat emancipation and citizenship as entwined or fundamentally distinct? How much leverage did blacks and their allies have? For someone like Federalist Peter Augustus Jay, John Jay's oldest son, who followed his father's footsteps by entering politics and serving in 1816 as the president of the Manumission Society, freedom and citizenship were two sides of the same coin. The state's Republicans often operated according to a different calculus, unfortunately. The 1799 Gradual Emancipation Law said nothing about African American eligibility for the franchise, and thus African Americans voted. In the state's intensely partisan, hotly contested political climate, black support for the Federalists could be consequential. It could tip elections. And both sides knew it. In 1811, the Republican legislature passed, quote, an act to prevent frauds and perjuries at elections, which was in part aimed at suppressing the black vote. All black voters had to present proof that they were not, in fact, slaves. This cumbersome voter ID legislation erected bureaucratic hurdles and the threat of conviction for perjury under the guise of fighting corruption while masking more sinister purposes. In a brilliant example of archival detective work, historian Sarah Groningseder, in a 2018 article, turned up evidence from multiple parts of the state of black men refusing to buckle, acquiring the necessary paperwork to go to the polls despite the intensifying effort to keep them away. Meanwhile, in late 1811, the Manumission Society decided the time had come to extend emancipation universally, not just to those born after July 4, 1799. A more definitive emancipation might help protect black New Yorkers from the insidious threats to their safety. Even though Republican Governor Daniel Tompkins was a Manumission Society member himself, a final emancipation law still had not passed by the time Peter Augustus Jay joined the legislature in 1816. He failed in his effort to reform existing slave law to give African Americans the same rights as white apprentices and to ensure the children of enslaved mothers received some literacy training before they entered their full freedom. He also failed to repeal an 1815 law making it even harder for African Americans in New York City to vote. Jay did not run for re-election. The Manumission Society and Governor Tompkins, however, pressed ahead. Manumission Society President Cadwallader D. Colden released a statement that 1817 should be the year to act, quote, in atonement for long injustice. The governor, meanwhile, was preparing to leave Albany for his new post as Vice President of the United States and appealed for action. The law was passed on March 31st, 1817, and that law was path-breaking or remaining in keeping with the spirit and mechanics of gradualism. What do I mean by this? Okay, so the law declares that on July 4th, 1827, any slave born on or before July 4th, 1799 was free. And I pause here to make the somewhat obvious point that the choice of the date July 4th is never accidental. On July 4th, 1817, the construction of the Erie Canal began with a ceremonial digging. Same year, 1817. The law also included the right of slaves to marry and articulated or re-articulated other limitations on slaveholders. But this 1817 law was also affirmed the operation of the laws of slavery in the interim between 1817 and 1827. Moreover, children born to enslaved mothers between the 10 years after the passage of the law but before July 4th, 1827, would be obligated to serve their mother's masters until age 21. So what does this mean? A child born on July 3rd, 1821 would be a bound laborer until July 3rd, 1848. The vulnerabilities and frauds that dogged African Americans before the law passed would thus remain in place for the foreseeable future, and that would matter before and after 1827. And yet the law also placed New York technically in the vanguard of states operating under the gradual emancipation formula, because New York put a hard cap on a legal end to slavery. Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island, although they adopted gradual emancipation much sooner, did not pass that sort of slavery ends on this date law before New York. I actually found a mistake in an exhibit in the New York Historical Society where they essentially make the opposite claim, but that's all right. No one's perfect. The battle over the meaning and substance of freedom, over the relationship between race and citizenship, remained an urgent and prominent concern in the wake of this law. So people didn't just wait around for 1827. Political time did not stand still between March 31st, 1817 and July 4th, 1827. In 1821, the state of New York convened a constitutional convention to replace its original revolutionary charter. The convention provided an occasion to revisit the issue of African American citizenship rights and the issue of slavery itself. Indeed, a group of free black men submitted a petition to the 1821 Constitution asking that their Constitution free them from these laws passed in 1811, 1813, and 1815 that made it harder for them to vote. Unfortunately, the Constitutional Convention had other plans. Even as the convention dismantled property holding requirements for white voters, a standard feature of American politics dating back to colonial times, the convention considered depriving all African Americans of the franchise entirely. The impassioned objections of Peter Augustus Jay helped to forestall this truly draconian end. But fueled by unapologetic racism and political expedience, the convention ultimately imposed a property holding requirement on black men, even as they essentially eliminated property holding requirements from white men. So essentially, baking into the Constitution a dual racial citizenship standard, the very thing that in 1785 the Council of Revision had opposed. Meanwhile, an attempt to record or even accelerate final emancipation in the new Constitution was soundly rebuffed. Even long-standing champions of gradual emancipation like Jay voted against it, while others claimed that the Constitution should remain silent on slavery lest the document embarrass future generations. And that might invite during the Q&A conversations about the U.S. Constitution, which you've noticed I've just completely bypassed in this talk. 1827, not 1821 or sometime in between, would remain the watershed moment, though New York's new Jim Crow voting system ensured that the river ahead had additional boulders around which seekers of equality would have to navigate. As if in preparation for July 4th, 1827, the nation's first African-American newspaper, Freedom's Journal, launched in March 1827 in New York. For all the shortcomings and caveats attached to Emancipation 1827, a new and vital chapter in the history of slavery in New York had begun. A Manhattan parade on July 5th brought the diverse urban black community together in an impressive public gathering, old and new, old and young, marking the occasion together. African Americans also marked the occasion in Cooperstown and Staten Island. William Hamilton's hyperbole, when the day of formal freedom finally arrived in July 1827, is understatable. This day has the state of New York regenerated herself. This day has she been cleansed of a most foul, poisonous, and damnable sin. The next day in Albany, Pastor Nathaniel Paul reminded his audience that 1.5 million people still remained in slavery, but he had faith that slavery would come to an end not just in the United States, but throughout the world. Without 1827, the New York of David Ruggles, Louis Napoleon, Sojourner Truth, Arthur and Lewis Tappan, James McCune Smith, Garrett Smith, Frederick Douglass, John Brown, Solomon Northup, William Henry and Francis Seward, Henry Highland Garnett, Harriet Tubman, and Alexander Crummell, and so many others is hard to imagine. Without 1827, the New York Underground Railroad, as we've come to know it, is hard to imagine. As the public historians and educators in the audience know, a bicentennial commemoration is an invitation for contemplation, the beginning of a discussion, an ellipsis rather than an exclamation point. So it was in July 1827. Something transformative took place. As the Freedom 2027 website aptly notes, a milestone had been achieved. There was much work ahead, much to learn, and much to teach. Thank you so much for listening. I'm really eager for your questions and what other reflections people choose to share this evening. But I will stop there.
Thank you again, David. That was a fantastic presentation. I'll give the floor to Peter, and we'll also start to anticipate some questions from the audience. Keep in mind that you're all muted and your videos are off. So if you'd like to ask a question via video, either raise your hand or unmute, and please begin.
David, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. The intricacies of this debate over 30 or 40 years. And also thank you for addressing the issue of the actual extension of mandatory service up until 1848. There has continued to be some dispute within the historical community about that. But I just want to touch briefly on one thing you did mention about the issue of New York State sugar. You're probably aware that the Quakers developed the whole free produce movement.
Yeah.
And the issue of syrup from cane sugar versus maple syrup, and then also some other issues, particularly clothing. Lucretia Mott in New York was a major advocate of that kind of a movement. So we do see that as evidence of part of this whole internal debate about how you can help to get rid of slavery and help spur freedom. Thank you.
Yeah, it was interesting to find the sort of forerunners of the free produce movement, of the forerunners of the beet sugar movement in Britain. It was surprising when that this began, whether or not people were aware of the precedent with this notion that was frankly part of William Cooper and other upstate New Yorkers' sort of development boosterism. But the fact that they expressed it and thought it would be effective to express this in moral language was fascinating to me.
Yep.
So do you want me to go into the chat or do you want to moderate the chat? We can do it however you want to do it.
Yeah, so far we don't have any questions, just commendations from our viewers.
David, I'll ask one more while everybody is forming their own questions. The July 4th and July 5th dates are also seen in some areas as, is there a truer representation of freedom? July 4th being, of course, the national holiday. And you noticed, as many of us understand this as well, you had Hamilton on the 4th, you had Nathaniel Paul on the 5th, and lots of other celebrations. Can you speak a little bit to that? What did you sense a divide within the Black community regarding, we don't want to celebrate on July 4th, we want our own celebration?
Yeah, no, there was a spirited debate in Freedom's Journal running up to the big day about this, about which was the more appropriate date, and that sort of ambivalence remains throughout the first half of the 19th century. Although I recently read that the fact that Frederick Douglass gave his famous "What to the Negro is the Fourth of July" on July 5th was actually a coincidence, and that was actually not a political statement, which I had always assumed it was a political statement, but apparently it was actually scheduling. But it does speak to that larger question about how and what and who should celebrate. And there was also a divide over whether this holiday should be celebrated in the streets or should be celebrated in sort of solemn and wholesome lectures. And there, much like the 2 days, different people went in different ways. I quoted Joseph Sidney's speech, but there was also a parade. And here I should point out the tension that often existed between the white paternalists of the New York Manumission Society and their black allies. Manumission Society was kind of unhappy about the idea of a parade and cautioned and counseled against it, as I don't know, too uncontrolled, too public, too in your face. So this was also not just this was a tension amongst African Americans, but also between whites and blacks about like what is the appropriate way or the most efficacious way or the way that's going to advance the interests of black people. Solemn speeches or public marches, July 4th or July 5th. And in reality, there were speeches and marches, and there were fourths and fifths. And of course, later in the century, there's also this question of like, should we be celebrating July 4th or August 1st, which is the British emancipation day in the West Indies. So the politics of the timing of celebrations is important, not just in my story, but continues on right up to the Civil War.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Always happy to answer questions or to hear people's reflections or concerns or things people know that I don't know, which I'm sure is a lot.
No questions in the chat currently, but anyone is welcome to unmute and contribute.
This is Mike in Freeville, New York. Thanks for the presentation. And I'm sorry I came in late and didn't see the first map. The second map makes me think about what had happened in those intervening years between 1775 and 1800. And one of those things was the Clinton-Sullivan campaign and opened up Western New York State for with the Trail of Tears of the Haudenosaunee people to the Niagara frontier, for example. And so the opening up of Western New York for the creation of those counties, it just makes me think about, as you mentioned, the Underground Railroad. Where do Haudenosaunee peoples come into this story, if at all? I mean, given the way that the U.S. government borrowed from the governance of the Confederacy at the time. Did any indigenous voices emerge as far as being anti-slavery, or are they a part of this story at all? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I'm sure there needs to be more research on that. I would have loved to have found that evidence. I have actually not found that evidence. The two ways in which Native Americans come into the story, one that I mentioned, which is the whole notion of maternity, because enslaved status follows the mother in a complete reversal of Anglo-American tradition where status follows the father. In the case of slaves, in every slave state in Anglo-America follows the mother. And so you have this sort of loophole of people who have female Native American ancestors claiming their freedom based on that. That's one place. I think the other place that it comes in a pretty unsavory way, and I hope I'm remembering the record correctly, is um, there's this whole notion in 1821 about who can be a voter and who can't be a voter. And one of the arguments that it's okay to disenfranchise African Americans is there's all kinds of people um, who are deprived of the vote. Women are deprived of the vote. Native Americans can't vote. Children can't vote. It's an incredibly offensive argument, but it is sort of the notion that so in other words, those who want to exclude blacks for racial and political reasons from the polls say we make all kinds of distinctions between different kinds of people. Everyone doesn't, in fact, get a vote. And I believe, although I will, of course, hope my memory is correct, I believe that Native Americans are entered into that, but sort of rhetorically. Um, and of course, um, there's plenty of anti-Native American racism through the use of faux dialects in jokes about Native Americans, just as there are jokes about Black people and jokes about Dutch people. Sort of the sort of voicing to degrade kind of thing does appear in the newspapers as well. But I do not have a good answer to the question of like, to the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee play a role in this. I mean, I think your larger point is really important, right? That there's always this sort of dualism, that the expansion of the state in a strange way helped to advance the cause of emancipation because you have large parts of the state where no one really has a stake in slavery anymore, changing the political calculus. But I mean, that comes at a real price. The expansion of the state, the sort of coincidence, it just sort of occurred to me today, the coincidence between the beginning of the Erie Canal and the passage of the 1817 law that's going to end slavery in 1827, right? So New York's rapid economic transformation, which is going to transform the state in all kinds of ways, and its move away from slavery as a sort of atavistic, not forward-looking economic institution. These things are happening at the same time. At the same time that the abolition of slavery is contemplated, so too is the question, well, should we be imprisoning debtors? Is this another sort of atavistic retrograde kind of relic of the past that we need to move on with as we progress into a sort of more dynamic free labor future? But that, as you say, comes at a severe price to Native Americans in the enlarged New York State. But thank you for that point.
Okay,
More than happy to answer questions.
yeah, we have a question from Chris Johnson. What was the extent of kidnapping from New York City and or state? Is there any documentation of the likely numbers of people?
Yeah, that's a question that's always bothered me is how to quantify that. I mean, what I would tell you is that the kidnapping never stops, ever,
Right.
right up to the Civil War. And there's been there's a whole book about that that came out a couple years ago. Um, it never stops. David Ruggles and the vigilance, the whole function of these the vigilance societies that form in the 1830s, have two functions, to protect people from being kidnapped and to sound the alarm when people are kidnapped, and also to, help spirit people through the Underground Railroad to their freedom. I mean, this need for vigilance never goes away. As long as slavery is a large, growing, economically dynamic institution in huge parts of the United States, every African American, free or enslaved, and after, as we get into the 1830s, we're talking about almost entirely free, are vulnerable. I mentioned when I was mentioning the list of people who's hard to imagine their stories, absent the gradual emancipation and ultimate emancipation, I specifically wanted to include Solomon Northup because his story, and I'm sure many people in the audience have read and seen the Academy Award winning movie 12 Years a Slave. I mean, he is an upstate New York free black man who is lured into Southern slavery and then comes back and is ultimately freed because he's able to communicate with people he knows in upstate New York and then writes this famous memoir of his horrible experience, right? I mean, that's a New York story that occurs long after this, 1827, but it's it's a story because New York is a free state from which he is removed. But in terms of numbers, it's really hard to tell. Some of the economic historians of the early 1970s did some calculations that said basically, and I think fairly persuasively, if you look at the size of the black population, it doesn't grow as fast that there must have been substantial kidnapping because otherwise the black population, free or otherwise, would have grown much faster. There's all these stories about people on the waterfront screaming bloody murder. And then, the New York Manumission Society lawyers being notified and sometimes, coming to the rescue, but not always. And we have to assume for everyone who gets freed that way, there are, surely large numbers of people we never hear about. And then away from New York in the western part of the state, there is no organization. So, I mean, I think, I hate to put a number on it because I don't actually have a number, but I think we can assume over that it's thousands. I think that's a safe assumption.
Mhm.
Okay, we have another question from A.M.A. Pelleter. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I'm looking for information about enslaved or free Black people's involvement in the construction of the Erie Canal. Do you know of any resources? The canal was being built during much of this time period.
I just saw there's a new book. I haven't read it, but I just saw a new book from Columbia University Press about the building of the Erie Canal. I find it hard to believe if you were writing a book on that subject in 2025 that you wouldn't have looked into that. So as I don't have specific information, I know that there's I'm sure if you go to the Columbia University Press website or go to Amazon, I'm sure you'll be able to locate the book. That would be the place to start because people are still writing about that really important history.
And I would add to that a recommendation to visit the Erie Canal Museum in Syracuse, New York. Historian Derek Pratt gives regular presentations on areas of that subject that may touch on that.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the thing about numbers is like, I mean, every number is a human life. So when I say there are very few enslaved and relatively few free Black people in those regions, it's not zero, and everybody's life matters. And like the men who built Rochester, you're always learning new stuff. So Rich Newman wrote a really good article in the Journal of Early Republic in the latest issue, where he talks about how Rochester, which obviously its ultimate importance as a city is because of its connection to the canal. That there's Southern white immigrants who bring enslaved people with them as laborers. So that's another place to look, I think, on the questions. The canal question is to look at the early history of Rochester. That would be another place you would find it. And like I say, just because there aren't large numbers doesn't mean that real people's lives are not affected and immiserated because of the lingering effects and the willingness of whites to flout or look for ways around laws and to assume that they will be weakly enforced, which they often are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great point about Rochester. I'll also add that the researchers at the Friends of Mount Hope Cemetery are also doing regular research. And I believe when I last spoke with one of them, they mentioned something that might support your search for this information. So feel free to contact Friends of Mount Hope Cemetery about this as well in Rochester.
Great.
All
We got
right.
a
I
hand.
think we're going to, unless somebody else out there has another question.
You have a hand
Got a
raised.
raised hand from Trishelle.
Hi, yes,
Oh,
this is
yeah.
Michelle. Hi, David. Thank you so much for the information. I looked up, an hour had gone by. I thought it was 15 minutes. So
Oh, thank you.
looking forward to the next installment. Just a reflection on how you mentioned that if a person was born to a Native American mother, how they were automatically free, but how that information probably wasn't available or known to everyone. So, how many people could have been free that weren't just because lack of information? But we see that lack of information puts Black and Brown people behind constantly, even with the Emancipation Proclamation being signed. And then a whole 2 years later, the last group of people finding out in Texas that they were free for over the last 18 months. But yeah, just a reflective point. Oh, and also the loophole kind of about if you claim Christianity, this is back in the 1600s or early 1700s, I believe. If a enslaved person claimed that they were Christian and converted, that they could become free. Not everybody knew of that loophole, but I'm sure if more people did, that more people would probably take advantage until they kind of found a way to legally close that loophole.
Yeah, so that loophole gets shut down pretty early. The in the Dutch period, that was much more of a loophole under the English system in all of the English colonies. That Christian loophole gets shut down quickly. It's even in the when I was reviewing the 1817 law, they repeat again. By the way, Christianity is not a get out of slavery, is still not a get out of slavery free card.
Right.
And the other thing I want to say, because you reminded me of something I just read. I was just reading the page proofs of a colleague's manuscript about different part of the country, Illinois, where there had been many enslaved people, largely held by people of French descent, who then, when it becomes part of America, they're still enslaved. And in the French and in the French Empire, they also say they try to move away from Native American slavery. But there's all this reclassification going on, which is to exactly to your point, where masters just reclassify, essentially to say, "Oh no, this is a mulatto," right? They
Right.
just they basically fictionalize a person's descent,
Yep.
um, and without a law and without an organization, without someone to represent you, it it's quite difficult. So yeah, this sort of I have no doubt, having read what was going on in Illinois, like just the reclassification is a way to get around those sorts of laws. And
Right.
I would imagine if we looked harder, we would probably find evidence of that in New York.
It's almost like DEI was needed back then. But yeah, thank you again for the information.
Oh, thank you so much.
Mhm.
All right, and now we have one more question from Kaylin Grant. Do you know anything about the Black population in the Binghamton area and displacement after the North Shore Drive Highway?
Uh, I do not. That is far far outside my temporal knowledge. I mean, I would love to learn about it, but I do not have any information about that. That's definitely far outside my expertise.
Some of the historians at Binghamton University may be able to point you in the right direction. I believe they have a Harriet Tubman Center. It's the title of their Center for African American Studies,
They probably have it.
past to present.
Any other questions? I mean, it's wonderful that on a Friday night that this many people want to hear about history. That's it's really incredibly heartening to think that there are this many people who are interested in this subject and are willing to give up a part of their weekend kickoff for this. It really is very inspiring.
Well, thank you again for providing inspiration and contributing your time to this as well. All right. So I put a link in the chat for everyone who's interested in learning more about Freedom 2027, New York's Emancipation Bicentennial. That's urcnys.org/ Freedom 2027. But David Gellman, do you have any links or closing remarks about how people can stay in touch or follow your studies and writing?
I mean, I am always happy to hear from people. So, it's dgellman at depaul.edu, Department of History, DePaul University. So, I always feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to hear from people professionally or otherwise about their thoughts, their interests. It's just been a tremendous honor to be here tonight. And I find myself increasingly kind of thinking about the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. So if you want to look up my reflections on what it means to teach about Abraham Lincoln in these particularly troubled times, I have something up on the Panorama website that you might want to look at. But I hope that that history matters to you, and that and I think it's so important that you're able to articulate to people who have power that you know something that contradicts what they may think you should do, say, or be. I think that is incredibly important. That is the power that history gives us as citizens, is that we can answer back and we can think carefully and critically.
Great. And say, just remind everybody again that we recorded this lecture, and where can they find it on our website?
It will eventually be available on the Freedom 2027 page of URCNYS.org. That is the website for the Underground Railroad Consortium of New York State. We also have a YouTube channel that we can put this on. So thank you, David Gellman, for
Thank you.
letting us make this available as well.
Great.
Thank you so much. It really, such a pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Gellman, so much for our first lecture. This was absolutely fabulous. So we should hope that they'll all be as great as this one. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Visit URCNYS, stay in touch, and we will see you in, let's see, October? No, September. We'll see you in September for our next meeting, which we're going lecture, which we're going to try to do quarterly during the course of the next couple of years. All right. Good night, everyone.
All right, thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Gellman. I'll be in
Thank
touch.
you.